At the beginning of the 2000s in Colombia, the name Alejandro Cardona began to be heard with force. For some, he was a young visionary with a magnetic speech, capable of awakening in hundreds of people the desire for financial independence. For others, he was simply a seller of illusions, someone who knew exactly which emotional buttons to press to make his audience open their wallets. The truth is that this young man, who came from an ordinary family without great luxuries or a powerful last name, knew how to take advantage of the moment when people were looking for a quick escape from the economic stagnation the country was experiencing. And he did it with a product that wasn't tangible, but much more seductive. Access to exclusive knowledge that, according to him, could transform anyone's life. I, at 19 years old, decided to become independent. But there came a moment when I felt so bad, I even had suicidal thoughts. Imagine right now with 50 people calling you aggressively to collect money. Then I heard another voice, the voice of God, and it told me, "You are not going to commit suicide. You are going to be a multimillionaire, Alejandro." So, literally, I had to die, start from the ashes, and rise again with a completely different structure. His best-known platform would carry a simple but powerful name, Creating Wealth. The title seemed to promise a direct formula, a clear path to the prosperity so many longed for. The seminars were not cheap, but the promise of doubling one's income and achieving total financial freedom seemed to justify the expense. Cardona dominated the stage. He spoke with confidence, used personal stories of overcoming hardships, cited examples of international entrepreneurs, and mixed basic financial concepts with motivational phrases that made the audience vibrate. Many attendees, upon leaving, claimed they had never felt such energy before, that for the first time, they believed it was possible to change their destiny. Behind that inspiring image, however, there was a carefully designed machine. The advertising played with testimonials from students who claimed to have achieved extraordinary goals in very little time. The videos showed luxury cars, international trips, and scenes of a carefree life. That narrative wasn't new, but it worked. The key was that it wasn't presented only as a course, but as an exclusive community. Whoever paid the entrance to the seminar didn't just acquire knowledge. They also became part of a select group of chosen ones who had information others didn't know. That sense of belonging was just as powerful as any promise of wealth. However, parallel to the applause and packed halls, questions began to arise. Some former attendees realized that the concepts Cardona presented as secrets could be found in any basic financial education manual. Others noticed that the success stories repeated again and again were not easy to verify. Had those students really multiplied their income in a matter of months? Or were they simply part of a carefully constructed marketing strategy? The shadow of doubt began to grow. While some saw him as a motivational leader, others began to suspect that the real business was not teaching how to create wealth, but endlessly selling the idea that it was possible, if you kept paying for the next level of the seminar. Very soon, Alejandro Cardona's figure began to divide opinions more and more sharply. In the front rows of his events, there were followers convinced they were in front of a misunderstood genius, someone who had discovered the formula for prosperity and was willing to share it with those who had the vision to listen. But farther back, almost in silence, voices began to appear questioning the truth of what they heard. They asked themselves, how could a relatively young man, without a clear business background or registered companies proving real wealth, teach with such authority about creating wealth? It was a contradiction that couldn't be ignored easily. Where did that money he flaunted as proof of success really come from? The structure of his seminars began to reveal a pattern. First, an introductory low-cost event that served as a gateway. There, Cardona displayed all his persuasive ability and dropped phrases that seemed like small revelations. That the traditional system was designed to keep people enslaved to a salary. That conventional education was a trap. That true knowledge was not taught in universities, but in alternative spaces like his. At the end of those talks came the irresistible invitation, a more advanced course with limited seats, where the true secrets of wealth would be revealed. And, of course, that course had a much higher price. The amounts people began paying were not small. Some invested their entire savings, others went into debt hoping that decision would be the turning point in their lives. Curiously, even though the content at each level seemed to repeat with minimal variations, the psychological pressure was so strong that few dared to question it openly. The narrative was built in such a way that any doubt was seen as a sign of mediocrity, as proof that whoever questioned was not ready for true financial freedom. Thus, many preferred to remain silent, keep paying, and pretend progress that never came, just to avoid being seen as the only ones not achieving results. As his events grew in attendance, so did his media visibility. In some circles, Cardona began to be compared to international figures in financial coaching. His advertising campaigns showed packed halls, standing ovations, and an increasingly large community. However, behind that successful facade, there were no clear balances nor documented evidence that his teachings were generating concrete changes in his followers' economy. The only verifiable thing was the constant flow of money. Coming in through the sale of seminars, the wealth shown on screen seemed to come not from brilliant investments or revolutionary strategies, but from the blind faith of thousands of attendees who bought again and again the promise of a better future. The controversy was not long in becoming public. Locale, newspapers and independent blogs began to point out that, in reality, what Cardona was building looked too much like a classic enrichment scheme based on tiered courses, where the real product was not education, but the expectation itself. When analyzing the content of his workshops carefully, critics found recycled phrases from self-help manuals, personal finance concepts taken from international authors, and a heavy dose of theatricality that kept the audience euphoric. There was no innovation, no exclusive method, only a charismatic rapper that made it seem unique. At the same time, his personal story became an essential part of his speech. Cardona spoke of humble origins, of how he had overcome difficulties, and how he now wanted to share that knowledge with others. It was a powerful story, because it reflected the lives of many of his followers. But the inconsistencies were evident. There were no records of the supposed businesses he claimed to have built, nor proof of the million-dollar contracts he mentioned in his conferences. In practice, his only project with tangible results seemed to be the seminar itself, and that contradiction fueled the suspicions even more. Was he a successful entrepreneur teaching his secrets, or a skilled storyteller who had found in people's hopes his main source of income? The testimonies began to pile up. I was encouraged to record this video to give my personal opinion about this seminar, Creating Wealth. It took me a few months to finally sign up, and when I did, I attended some sessions live, in real time. Not directly with Alejandro Cardona, but I followed the program for about 2 weeks. Honestly, it didn't give me the results I expected. I tried to follow the trends, the strategies he described, and the methods he talked about. But I didn't see results, at least not the ones I was hoping for. Since it cost about $99 at the time, I'm talking about 2023, I decided to take the seminar again. This time I took careful notes. I even got the Creating Wealth book, I sketched strategies, and followed everything more attentively. After 2 or 3 weeks, I realized it was the same: random, inconsistent, and not convincing. Honestly, I didn't get a good impression of this seminar. In my opinion, it didn't work for me. These kinds of testimonials set off alarms that soon caught the attention of journalists, financial analysts, and even authorities. Investigations into Cardona revealed a troubling pattern. Many of the supposed success cases shown in promotional videos were impossible to track. The names and faces that appeared again and again, when examined closely, showed no records of registered businesses, scaled projects, or profitable investments. It was as if they were part of a gallery carefully staged to inspire confidence, but with no real foundation behind it. And when someone tried to obtain concrete proof, the answer was always ambiguous. Each process is personal. Results depend on each student's commitment. In this way, the responsibility for failure always fell on the victim. While the system remained intact, Cardona's international expansion only made the criticism more visible. He traveled to several Latin American countries, presenting himself as a leader in financial education. And in each place, the same pattern appeared: crowded auditoriums, ambitious promises, increasingly expensive courses, and a growing number of disillusioned people. In some countries, the pressure reached such a point that authorities began investigating the nature of his business, trying to determine if there was fraud hidden behind the motivational facade. But the legal loopholes worked in his favor. Technically, Cardona wasn't offering investments or regulated financial products. What he was selling was knowledge and motivation, categories much harder to supervise. In the midst of the controversy, Cardona's charisma remained his strongest shield. Even when criticism intensified, he could still gather crowds that cheered him as a visionary leader. His ability to speak in public, to blend personal anecdotes with messages of empowerment, kept him at the top of the conference circuit. For many of his followers, the accusations were nothing more than envy, a natural reaction against someone who dared to challenge the established system. This unshakable loyalty created a paradoxical effect. The more he was questioned, the more his followers believed he was revealing uncomfortable truths that the powerful wanted to silence. Nevertheless, the accumulation of negative stories began to outline a reality that was hard to ignore. Several former attendees declared that they had been psychologically pressured to pay for additional courses, under the promise that the next level contained the ultimate key. Some even mortgaged properties or went into debt with banks to cover the cost of the most exclusive seminars, convinced that this would be the final investment before reaching the promised wealth. After months, disappointment was inevitable. The content barely changed. The techniques taught were superficial or directly copied from books anyone could buy in a bookstore. The emotional impact was devastating. People who had placed all their trust in Cardona not only lost money, but also had their self-esteem shattered, feeling guilty for not achieving what was promised. The harshest critics began to call it an emotional scam, a system where the truly profitable thing was not the knowledge, but the machinery of persuasion that kept the illusion alive. The business wasn't about producing successful entrepreneurs, but about selling hope in increasingly expensive installments. Each story of failure reinforced this idea, showing a cycle where the only true winners were those who controlled the stage. And although Cardona was never convicted in court, the label of scammer began sticking to his name in forums, social media, and alternative media outlets. The case of Alejandro Cardona became an uncomfortable mirror of an era. It represented the clash between a society desperate for quick solutions and an industry of coaching ready to capitalize on that need. He wasn't the only one in the market, but he was one of the most visible, and that made him the target of stronger criticism. Each conference, each promotional video, and each false or exaggerated testimony added to a narrative that became increasingly hard to defend. And yet, the magnetism of his figure continued to attract crowds. The enigma persisted. Was he a clever fraud who exploited people's vulnerability, or a legitimate motivator whose methods were simply misunderstood? That unanswered question kept Cardona at the center of debate. Over time, however, his image began to deteriorate irreversibly. The same marketing machinery that once boosted him to fame started working against him. The more visible he became, the more the cracks in his story were exposed. On social media, compilations of testimonies circulated, people calling him a scammer, videos of ex-attendees describing their losses, investigative articles questioning the lack of evidence behind his business, and forums entirely dedicated to debating his authenticity. The discussion went from local to regional, and his image declined faster than even his charisma could handle. The downfall wasn't sudden, but a slow process of erosion, it became harder and harder for him to fill auditoriums. Many of his once loyal defenders began to distance themselves when they realized they couldn't verify the results being advertised. Former collaborators also began speaking out, revealing that much of the strategy behind the seminars was to keep the audience in an altered emotional state, almost euphoric. So, their purchasing decisions were impulsive. They used well-studied psychological pressure techniques, limiting available seats, announcing exclusive discounts for immediate registration, or warning that anyone who hesitated was condemning themselves to a life of mediocrity. It was a perfectly rehearsed script, and little by little, it began to be exposed. Investigative journalism uncovered darker aspects. Many of the luxuries Cardona flaunted, high-end cars, exotic trips, impressive properties, weren't actually his. Some were rented just for promotional material. Others belonged to people in his circle, lending their image to feed the narrative of success. What looked like a solid fortune was, in large part, a carefully staged set. For critics, this revelation was the final confirmation. Everything had been a grand illusion. Meanwhile, financial authorities began receiving more formal complaints. Although fraud charges were hard to pursue legally, since these were motivational seminars, not direct investments, the investigations did manage to alert the public about the risks of such practices. In some countries, he was even prohibited from organizing events until meeting transparency and registration requirements. These restrictions, combined with the growing social rejection, weakened his power to convene. Cardona never faced a formal conviction for fraud, but the stain on his name became impossible to erase. The impact on his followers was profound. Many were scarred not just by economic loss, but also by the emotional wound of having trusted someone who sold them a dream of a better future that turned out to be nothing but a mirage. For some, the experience was a bitter lesson about vulnerability in times of crisis, when the need for quick solutions clouds judgment. For others, it was a turning point that made them distrust any motivational speech, no matter how genuine it might be. In a way, Cardona's figure contaminated the entire sector, making even legitimate financial coaches look suspicious. And yet, the enigma around Alejandro Cardona remains unresolved, not because there are doubts about the effects of his seminars that is widely documented, but because conflicting versions about his intentions persist. Some argue that beyond the manipulation, Cardona truly believed in his message of empowerment and financial freedom, even if his execution was questionable. Others are certain it was a project calculated from the very beginning to enrich himself at the expense of others. Faith, the line between a misunderstood motivator and a professional scammer, is so thin that his story remains suspended in that ambiguous space where truth and perception blur. Today, his name still appears in debates about self-help seminars and the promises of quick wealth. For some, he is a reminder of how far manipulation can go when charisma meets human need. For others, he is simply a symbolic case of the fine line between inspiration and deception. What no one disputes is the impact Alejandro Cardona left. His story is not just about a man, but about a much broader phenomenon. Entire societies willing to believe in shortcuts to success, even when those shortcuts in most cases lead nowhere.